Hello and welcome to Nana's Crafty Home. My name is Tanya. Today's tutorial is going to show you how to crochet a two-color or the half and half granny. This is a basic granny square, so we're using the granny stitch and we are working it in two different colors. So we have exactly half of the granny square in one color and the other half of the granny square in a second color, and it creates this really interesting effect. And then we can take this granny square and we can mix and match it with solids or with other half and half grannies in order to make different designs and blankets and hats and scarves, whatever. And it's just a variation of our basic beginner friendly granny square. And we just do something a little different so that we don't have a ton of ends to weave in. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and start with our first color, so color A here, and we're going to get that on our hook. And we're going to start with a chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to be working in the last chain from the hook. So the first chain that we made, I'm going to be working 2 double crochets. Those skipped chains are going to count as my first stitch of a cluster. And when I refer to cluster, that is going to mean 3 double crochets all worked in the same space or the same stitch. So I have my first cluster here with my skipped chains counting as my first double crochet of a 3 double crochet cluster. And then I'm going to chain 2 and then work another 3 double crochet cluster in that same chain. So in that same space, work 3 more double crochets to make my second cluster of round 1. Now I'm going to chain 1 and I'm going to bring in my second color. And I'm going to bring in my second color. I'm going to leave an end for me to weave in later, but I'm going to put that on my hook and then pull through, basically working my second chain with that color change. And so that chain 2, those 2 chains together are going to count as a chain 2 corner space. Now with my new color, and you can see I'm just dropping that first color, just leaving it. So I'll pick it up the next round, and I'm going to work another 3 double crochet cluster in that same chain, that same space. So there's 1, 2, 3, chain 2, so I'm making another chain 2 corner space and work another 3 double crochet cluster in that same space. So I'm starting this with exactly the same way that I would start a traditional granny square, except I'm using 2 different colors. Now after I've completed that 3 double crochet cluster, I'm going to chain 1 and I want to join at the end of this round with the beginning skipped chains, and I'm going to do that by working a half double crochet join. So I'm going to yarn over just as I would for a half double crochet, and I'm going to insert my hook in the top of those skipped chains from the beginning, yarning over and pulling up a loop, 3 loops on the hook, yarning over, pulling through all 3 to complete that half double crochet join. So for this pattern, we're going to need to turn to work round 2. So for round 2, I want to chain 3, 1, 2, 3. So as you can see, I have 4 chain 2 corner spaces, or 4 corner spaces here with 4 clusters, 2 in each color. So I've started working that first corner by working my chain 3, which is going to count as my first stitch of a 3 double crochet cluster. So I want to now work 2 double crochets in that same space. So I've worked that first cluster in that same space. I want to skip over that next cluster and work into that next corner, and my corners are 3 double crochet stitches, basically working 1 cluster, chain 2 for another corner space, and then another 3 double crochet cluster worked in that same space. So I've made another corner. I'm going to skip over that next cluster, and now you can see this is where I change colors. So where I've changed colors in the middle of a chain 2 space, I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to work into that chain 2 space by working another 3 double crochet cluster in this color, chain 1, and drop that color, and now I want to pull in color A, the first color I was working with. And you're going to do that by yarning over and then pulling through with a chain, just as we did in the previous round. You don't want a lot of slack in this because we don't want a big, if we leave a lot of slack, this thing is going to stick out. We don't want that. So we want it tight, but not to where we're pulling it so tight that it scrunches up our work. So I'm going to work another 3 double crochet cluster in that same space to complete this corner. I dropped that color and I will leave it to pick it up again when I come back around. So you can see there is that yarn jog, but it's pretty invisible. It's right up and next my 3 double crochet cluster, and I didn't need to cut and weave in that end. Great. Okay, so I have another chain 2 corner space. I'm going to skip over that next cluster, and I'm going to work another cluster, chain 2, and cluster in that chain 2 corner space. Now, this was from the beginning of the round, and you can see this was my first cluster of the round. This was my chain 3 and my 2 double crochets, and I'm going to be working in this space. This is that half double crochet join from that previous round, and I'm going to be working a cluster in that space. Chain 1 and repeat a half double crochet join, and you're going to be joining in that chain 3 from the beginning to complete the round. And then turn, and we're working round 3, chain 3, 2 double crochets to complete our first cluster in that same space. Skip over that next cluster, and I'm going to be working a 3 double crochet cluster in that space in between these 2 clusters. In my chain 2 corner space, work a cluster, chain 2, and a cluster, all worked in that same chain 2 corner space. Skip that next cluster, work a cluster in between. in the next chain 2 corner space. Again, this is where I'm going to be changing colors. You can see I dropped that previous color, and we're going to do the same thing, working in that chain 2 corner space. And make sure that when you're working in this chain 2 space, you don't accidentally get underneath that yarn jog from that previous round. Make sure that it's on the other side of that in the chain 2 corner space. Otherwise, you're going to see that and it's going to stick out in your work, and you don't want that. So my first cluster, chain 1, drop that color, pull in the second color by yarning over and pulling in with a chain, and then work another cluster in that same space. Another cluster in between. Cluster, chain 2, cluster, and the next chain 2 corner space. Cluster in the next space between the clusters. And I'm back at the beginning. This is that first cluster, chain 3. This is that half double crochet join from the previous round. I'm going to work my last cluster in that space. Chain 1, half double crochet join in the top of that chain 3 from the beginning. Turn, chain 3, cluster, beginning cluster, which is a chain 3 and 2 double crochets worked in the same space. And now we're going to be working in each space between clusters to the next chain 2 corner space. I'm going to work a cluster. So between these 2 clusters here, a cluster, between these 2 clusters here, a cluster, to my next chain 2 corner space. And this is my repeat round. So I'm just going to continue repeating this same round for however big I want to make my square. Between clusters, working a cluster, and in the corners, working a cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 2, cluster in that same space, cluster in between the clusters from the previous round until I get to that next chain 2 corner space. That next chain 2 corner space is where I'm going to now again change colors, work my first cluster in this color, chain 1, drop that color, pull in the previous, the yarn over, and a chain, cluster in the new color, and then a cluster between clusters, until we get to the next chain 2 corner space. Chain 2, cluster in that same chain 2 space, cluster in between, we're at the beginning. This is my first 3 double crochet cluster with that chain 3, work my cluster in that half double crochet join, chain 1, half double crochet in the top of that chain 3 from the beginning. And I've completed round 4. So you can see here I have a 2-color granny square where I have an equal amount of clusters in each color on each half. And you're just going to continue repeating that same round throughout. So however big you want to make your square, just continue repeating round 4. You can see you don't have a ton of ends to weave in. We just have those 2 from the beginning, and then we'll have 2 at the end, which is fantastic with all of that color work going on there. But by turning, we're able to drop and then pick up on the next round and continue on in our work without cutting our yarn. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. Thanks so much for being with me. As always, remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you never miss a new video. Thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.